The briefing room fell silent as the infrared satellite feed flickered to life on the main screen. Somewhere over the contested airspace of Eastern Europe, an unidentified aircraft had been broadcasting a signal that shouldn't exist. The frequency was obsolete, the encryption ancient by modern standards, yet the pattern was unmistakable to those who knew their history. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short again. SOS in Morse code, transmitted through navigation strobes at precisely timed intervals that matched no current military protocol. Ghost Contact has been maintaining this pattern for 6 hours, Colonel Martinez announced, his weathered face illuminated by the blue glow of the tactical display. Intelligence suggests it's either a sophisticated deception operation or, he paused, studying the faces of the assembled pilots. Something we haven't seen since the Kosovo conflict. Captain Lydia Valkyrie Kowalski shifted in her seat at the back of the room, her gray eyes fixed on the rhythmic pattern of lights blinking across enemy territory. 23 years in military aviation had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now every nerve ending screamed that this wasn't standard operating procedure for any known adversary. The timing was too precise, too deliberate. Someone was trying to communicate using a method that predated digital warfare by nearly a century. The other pilots exchanged skeptical glances. Major Harrison, Coulson Blade, turned in his chair and smirked. Probably some academy dropout who can't figure out how to work modern avionics. Should be a milk run. His comment drew chuckles from the younger aviators, but Valkyrie noticed how Colonel Martinez's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She had seen that expression before, during classified briefings about operations that officially never happened. The kind of missions where pilots returned with hollow eyes and sealed lips, carrying secrets that would follow them to their graves. The strobing pattern continued its hypnotic rhythm on screen, each flash a heartbeat in the darkness, a desperate message spanning decades of military evolution. Outside the briefing room windows, the pre-dawn sky stretched endlessly, painted in shades of steel and shadow that reminded Valkyrie of her first combat mission over Bosnia. She had been 26 then, fresh out of advanced fighter training and hungry to prove herself in a cockpit traditionally reserved for men. The memory of that initial sortie remained vivid. The weight of responsibility, the crystalline clarity of fear transformed into focused precision, the moment when theoretical knowledge became visceral reality. Now approaching her 24th year of service, Valkyrie had earned the respect of her peers through consistency and competence rather than bravado. Her maintenance crew trusted her to bring their aircraft home intact. Her wingmen knew she would never abandon them in hostile airspace. But respect, she had learned, was different from acceptance. The casual dismissal in Harrison's voice confirmed what she had always suspected, that some of her fellow pilots still saw her as an anomaly rather than an asset. The briefing continued with standard tactical parameters and rules of engagement, but Valkyrie's attention remained fixed on that persistent pattern of lights. Somewhere in the darkness, someone was calling for help using a language that spoke directly to the soul of military aviation. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. The universal cry for assistance, transmitted through the infinite canvas of sky that had claimed so many of her brothers and sisters in arms. Colonel Martinez concluded the briefing with assignments for the 4-ship formation that would investigate the mysterious signal. Blade, your flight lead. Phoenix and Hammer, your 2 and 3. Valkyrie, he met her steady gaze across the room. Your flying tail and Charlie. Stay sharp and keep your eyes open for anything unusual. The dismissal in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. Once again, she would be relegated to the least critical position, the pilot responsible for watching everyone else's backs while they claimed the glory of frontline engagement. The other pilots filed out of the briefing room with the casual confidence that came from years of air superiority. Their conversations centered on weapons loadouts and fuel calculations, the technical minutiae that transformed theoretical air power into devastating reality. But Valkyrie lingered, studying the satellite feed, with the intensity of someone who understood that warfare was as much about interpreting human intention as it was about managing advanced technology. The strobing pattern had not deviated once during the 30-minute briefing. Whoever was flying that aircraft possessed either remarkable discipline or desperate determination. The precision required to maintain such consistent timing while potentially under duress suggested a pilot with extensive training and iron-willed focus. This was not the signature of someone who had lost control of their aircraft or their situation. As the briefing room emptied, Valkyrie approached the tactical display for a closer examination. The flight path of the mysterious aircraft described a shallow orbit that kept it just inside contested airspace, close enough to international boundaries to complicate any intercept mission. The pilot was clearly experienced enough to understand the political ramifications of airspace violations, yet bold enough to maintain position despite the obvious risks. She traced the orbital pattern with her finger, noting how the aircraft's heading changes coincided with specific geographic landmarks. The route was not random. It was carefully calculated to provide maximum visibility to satellite surveillance while avoiding known surface-to-air missile sites. Someone was putting on a deliberate show, but the performance was intended for a very specific audience. The implications crystallized in her mind with uncomfortable clarity. This was not a standard reconnaissance mission or a probe of air defense capabilities. The mysterious pilot was broadcasting a message that transcended national boundaries and political conflicts. The use of Morse code suggested someone with deep roots in military tradition, a pilot who understood that certain aspects of warfare remained constant despite technological evolution. Walking toward the equipment locker, Valkyrie felt the familiar pre-flight mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Her flight suit bore the patches and insignia earned through 2 decades of dedicated service, combat ribbons from 3 different conflicts, instructor qualifications, and the subdued wings that marked her as a senior aviator. Yet despite these credentials, she knew that today's mission would likely follow the same pattern as dozens of others. She would maintain formation, follow orders, and watch from the periphery as younger, more aggressive pilots took center stage. The morning air carried the distinctive scent of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid that had become as familiar as perfume. Ground crews moved with practiced efficiency around the sleek forms of 4 F-22 Raptors, each aircraft representing the pinnacle of American air superiority technology. Their angular surfaces and exotic materials could bend radar waves and slip through enemy air defenses like ghosts, transforming pilots into invisible predators stalking through hostile airspace. Valkyrie approached her assigned aircraft with the reverence of someone who truly understood the marriage between human capability and mechanical precision. Every pre-flight inspection was performed with meticulous attention to detail, not because regulations demanded it, but because her life and the lives of her teammates depended on the flawless operation of thousands of interconnected systems. The F-22 was simultaneously the most sophisticated and most unforgiving aircraft she had ever flown. Her crew chief, Master Sergeant Reynolds, greeted her with the easy familiarity of someone who had worked with her for nearly 5 years. "She's ready to dance, Captain. All systems green, weapons load verified, and I personally checked every bolt and rivet." His pride in his work was evident in every word. Reynolds understood that maintaining these aircraft was not just a job. It was a sacred trust between those who flew and those who ensured they could return home safely. The cockpit of the Raptor enveloped Valkyrie like a second skin as she settled into the ejection seat and began the complex startup procedures. Displays came alive with cascading streams of data, each screen providing critical information about aircraft systems, weather conditions, and tactical situations. The helmet-mounted display projected flight parameters directly onto her visor, creating an augmented reality environment where digital information merged seamlessly with the physical world. Radio check with the control tower confirmed that all 4 aircraft were ready for departure. The voices of her fellow pilots crackled through her headset with the professional terseness that characterized military aviation. Call signs replaced names, reducing individual personalities to functional roles within the larger mission framework. Blade, Phoenix, and Hammer represented capability rather than character, pilots defined by their tactical contributions rather than their personal histories. The taxi to the active runway provided a final opportunity to review mission parameters and contingency plans. The mysterious aircraft remained in its orbital pattern, continuing to broadcast the same repetitive signal that had triggered this intercept mission. Intelligence estimates suggested they would reach the contact within 47 minutes of takeoff, providing enough fuel for a thorough investigation and safe return to base. Tower cleared the four-ship formation for departure, and Valkyrie felt the familiar surge of power as her F-22's twin engines spooled up to military thrust. The acceleration pressed her back into the seat as the runway blurred past, concrete and painted lines merging into abstract patterns. At rotation speed, she pulled back gently on the stick, and the aircraft lifted away from Earth with the effortless grace that never failed to inspire wonder, even after thousands of flight hours. Climbing through 10,000 feet, the formation spread into combat formation with Blade leading, and the others positioned for mutual support and optimal radar coverage. Below them, the countryside rolled past in geometric patterns of agricultural fields and suburban developments, peaceful and ordered in the morning light. It was difficult to reconcile this tranquil landscape with the fact that they were heading toward potential combat against an unknown adversary. The flight toward the intercept coordinates passed in routine radio calls and navigation updates, but Valkyrie found herself increasingly troubled by the mission parameters. Standard protocol for investigating unknown aircraft involved specific escalation procedures designed to minimize the risk of international incidents. Visual identification was followed by radio contact attempts, then increasingly aggressive maneuvering to compel compliance with air traffic control directives. But this situation felt different. The persistent Morse code transmission suggested a pilot who understood military communication protocols, but had chosen to use an archaic method that bypassed modern encryption systems. Someone was sending a message that could be interpreted by anyone with basic knowledge of aviation history, yet the content remained tantalizingly unclear. Was this a distress call, a deception operation, or something more complex? As they approached the patrol area, Blade's voice cut through the routine radio chatter. Contact bearing 270, Angels 15, appears to be maintaining the reported orbital pattern. Phoenix, take high cover. Hammer, swing wide left. Valkyrie, maintain current position and keep your eyes open for any additional contacts. The formation began to spread out in preparation for what promised to be a textbook intercept of a single, apparently non-threatening aircraft. The first visual contact came as they closed to within 5 nautical miles of the mysterious aircraft. Through her helmet-mounted display, Valkyrie could make out the distinctive silhouette of what appeared to be an older generation fighter, possibly European in origin. The aircraft's clean configuration suggested it was not carrying external weapons, but appearances could be deceiving in modern aerial warfare where internal bays concealed sophisticated ordnance. More intriguing was the deliberate precision of the aircraft's flight path. The pilot was maintaining exact altitude and airspeed, while executing turns that brought the aircraft through precisely the same geographic coordinates on each orbit. This level of consistency required exceptional skill and unwavering concentration, attributes that contradicted the theory of a confused or incapacitated aviator. Blade initiated the standard intercept protocol with radio calls on both military and civilian emergency frequencies. Unknown aircraft in Sector 77 Alpha, you are in violation of restricted airspace. Identify yourself immediately and comply with air traffic control instructions. The transmission was clear and professional, designed to establish contact without unnecessarily escalating tension. No response came through the radio, But Valkyrie noticed that the aircraft's navigation strobes continued their hypnotic pattern. 3 short flashes, pause, 3 long flashes, pause, 3 short flashes. The timing was so precise that it had to be manually controlled rather than automated, confirming the presence of a conscious pilot who was choosing to maintain radio silence while broadcasting through visual signals. As the formation closed to within 2 nautical miles, details of the unknown aircraft became clearly visible. It was indeed an older fighter, bearing no visible national markings or squadron identifiers. The paint scheme was a neutral gray that could have originated from any number of air forces, providing no clues about the pilot's nationality or intentions. More significantly, the aircraft showed signs of combat damage, scorched panels along the fuselage, and what appeared to be patches covering emergency repairs. The sight of battle damage transformed the intercept from a routine patrol into something more complex and emotionally charged. This was not a probe of air defenses or a training exercise gone wrong. Someone had fought their way to this position, sustaining damage that would have forced most pilots to seek the nearest suitable airfield for immediate landing. Yet here they were, maintaining a precise orbital pattern while broadcasting a distress signal that spanned generations of military aviation. Valkyrie keyed her microphone to report her observations to the flight leader. Blade, Valkyrie. The unknown aircraft shows signs of combat damage and appears to be flying a damaged bird. Recommend we consider this a potential emergency assistance case rather than a hostile intercept. Her voice carried the measured professionalism that came from years of experience, but underlying her words was a growing sense that this mission was about to become something very different from what they had anticipated. The response from Blade was immediate and dismissive. Valkyrie, maintain radio discipline and stay in position. We follow standard intercept procedures regardless of aircraft condition. His tone carried a subtle rebuke for what he apparently considered an unnecessary emotional response to what should remain a purely tactical situation. The other pilots maintained radio silence, neither supporting nor contradicting their flight leader's directive. But as they drew closer to the damaged aircraft, Valkyrie found it impossible to ignore the human element of what they were witnessing. Someone was flying a crippled fighter in hostile airspace, maintaining perfect formation discipline while broadcasting a plea for help using methods that predated satellite communications. The courage required for such a demonstration was both inspiring and heartbreaking, representing the kind of dedication to duty that defined the best traditions of military aviation. The formation settled into a standard intercept pattern with the unknown aircraft at its center. Blade positioned his F-22 directly ahead and slightly above, while Phoenix and Hammer took flanking positions that would allow them to respond quickly to any threatening maneuvers. Valkyrie maintained her assigned position slightly behind and below the others, providing rear coverage while observing the tactical situation from a different perspective. From her vantage point, she could see details that were invisible to the other pilots. The damaged aircraft's control surfaces moved in tiny, continuous adjustments that suggested the pilot was fighting to maintain straight and level flight. Hydraulic fluid leaked from somewhere in the port wing route, leaving a faint contrail that dissipated quickly in the thin air. Most tellingly, the canopy showed the distinctive spider web pattern of cracking that resulted from bird strikes or combat damage. Through the fractured transparency, she caught brief glimpses of the pilot, a figure hunched over the controls with the focused intensity of someone pushing both aircraft and personal capabilities to their absolute limits. The pilot's helmet obscured facial features, but body language spoke volumes about physical and emotional exhaustion. This was someone who had been flying on pure determination and professional skill long after normal endurance would have demanded an emergency landing. The formation maintained its intercept pattern for several minutes, while Blade continued attempts to establish radio contact. Each unanswered transmission heightened the tension, but Valkyrie noticed that the unknown aircraft never deviated from its orbital pattern or made any maneuvers that could be interpreted as hostile. The pilot was clearly aware of their presence, but seemed focused solely on maintaining the precise flight path and continuing the Morse code transmissions. Something about the situation nagged at the edges of Valkyrie's consciousness, a half-remembered detail that refused to crystallize into clear recognition. The combination of the aircraft type, the damage pattern, and the specific use of Morse code triggered memories that felt significant but remained tantalizingly out of reach. She had seen something like this before, or heard about it in conversations that carried the weight of classified history. The breakthrough came when she noticed the specific timing of the strobe pattern. It was not simply SOS repeated at random intervals. The flashes followed a precise sequence. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, then a longer pause before the pattern repeated. But during that pause, there were additional flashes so brief and subtle that they were almost invisible unless someone was specifically looking for them. Hidden within the standard distress call was additional information encoded in a method that predated modern digital encryption. Valkyrie keyed her microphone for a discreet transmission to the flight leader. Blade, Valkyrie. Recommend we extend observation time. The target's strobe pattern contains additional coded information beyond standard SOS. This may be more complex than a simple emergency situation. Her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone offering tactical advice, while avoiding direct challenge to command authority. The response was swift and sharp. Valkyrie, you're seeing things that aren't there. Maintain position and prepare to escort the target to the nearest suitable airfield for landing and investigation. We're not here to play detective. Blade's dismissal was complete, but Valkyrie noticed that Phoenix's F-22 had moved slightly closer to the unknown aircraft, suggesting that at least one other pilot had observed something worth investigating more carefully. As the formation began to shift into escort configuration, the damaged aircraft suddenly broke from its orbital pattern and began climbing toward a heading that would take it deeper into contested airspace. The maneuver was executed with smooth precision that contradicted the visible battle damage, suggesting that the pilot had been conserving both fuel and aircraft capability for exactly this moment. This was not the random action of someone in distress. It was a calculated tactical decision made by someone with extensive training and clear strategic objectives. Blade's voice exploded through the radio with the sharp edge of someone whose authority had been directly challenged. Unknown aircraft, you will comply with escort instructions immediately, or we will consider you hostile and respond accordingly. Turn to heading 180 and descend to flight level 200 immediately. The transmission carried the weight of military authority backed by overwhelming firepower, the kind of ultimatum that typically ended aerial confrontations before they could escalate into actual combat. But the damaged aircraft continued its climb and turn, navigation strobes still flashing their coded message with metronomic precision. The pilot was either unable to hear radio transmissions due to equipment damage, or was deliberately choosing to ignore direct orders from what was obviously a superior force. Neither possibility boded well for a peaceful resolution to the intercept mission that was rapidly evolving into something much more serious. The 4 F-22s adjusted their formation to match the unknown aircraft's new heading and rate of climb, their advanced engines easily keeping pace with the older fighter's more limited performance envelope. But Valkyrie noticed that the damaged aircraft was climbing at its maximum sustainable rate, trading altitude for time while heading toward what intelligence maps indicated was heavily defended enemy airspace. Someone was making a desperate run for sanctuary, using every available resource to reach safety before fuel exhaustion or mechanical failure made the decision for them. The tactical situation had shifted from intercept to potential combat, and Valkyrie felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied the transition from routine patrol to life-or-death decision-making. Her hands moved automatically through weapons system checks, while her eyes scanned the sky for additional threats that might be converging on their position. In modern aerial warfare, single aircraft rarely operated alone. Somewhere in the surrounding airspace, additional players were likely positioning themselves for whatever was about to unfold. Blade's next transmission confirmed the escalation. All flights, weapons hot. Unknown aircraft has 30 seconds to comply with escort instructions, or we will consider it hostile and take appropriate action. The words transformed 4 F-22s from observers into potential executioners, each pilot now responsible for making split-second decisions that could determine whether the damaged aircraft would land safely or be destroyed in midair, along with its mysterious pilot. But as Valkyrie watched the older fighter climbing steadily toward what might be its final destination, she realized that she was witnessing something that transcended standard intercept procedures. The precision of the pilot's control, the deliberate nature of the escape attempt, and most significantly, the continued transmission of coded signals suggested someone with deep connections to military aviation history. This was not a random encounter with a confused or hostile aviator. This was a meeting with someone who embodied the traditions and sacrifices that defined air combat across multiple generations. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place as she recognized the specific aircraft type and configuration. It was an F-16 variant that had been out of active American service for nearly 15 years. Yet the modifications and damage patterns matched classified photographs she had seen during intelligence briefings about pilots who had disappeared during deep reconnaissance missions over hostile territory. Someone who should have been declared killed in action years ago was flying a damaged fighter toward what might be their last chance for freedom, using communication methods that connected current events to the earliest days of military aviation. Understanding flooded through her with crystalline clarity. The pilot was not ignoring radio calls due to equipment failure or hostile intentions. They were maintaining communication silence because speaking would reveal information that could compromise ongoing operations or endanger other personnel. The Morse code transmissions were not random distress calls. They were specific identification signals that could be decoded by someone with access to classified communication protocols that had been considered obsolete for decades. Valkyrie made a decision that would define the remainder of her military career. Instead of following standard intercept procedures, she was going to trust her instincts and the accumulated wisdom of 23 years in military aviation. Someone ahead of her was asking for help using a language that spoke directly to the soul of air combat, and she was going to answer that call regardless of the consequences to her career or her relationship with fellow pilots who might not understand the significance of what they were witnessing. She keyed her microphone for a transmission that would change everything. Blade, Valkyrie, request permission to attempt direct visual contact with the target aircraft. I believe the pilot may be unable to respond to radio calls due to equipment damage, but might be able to communicate through alternative methods. Her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had made a decision and was prepared to accept full responsibility for the consequences. The response was immediate and sharp. Negative, Valkyrie. Maintain current position and prepare to engage on my command. We are not going to risk additional aircraft on some half-baked theory about alternative communication methods. Blade's dismissal was complete, but Valkyrie noticed that her radio transmission had prompted the unknown aircraft to waggle its wings slightly, the first acknowledgement that the pilot was aware of their presence and capable of responding to external stimuli. The wing waggle was significant because it represented a standard visual signal used throughout military aviation to indicate awareness and non-hostile intent. Someone was trying to communicate using methods that predated radio technology, demonstrating both desperation and professional competence. The damaged aircraft was being flown by someone with extensive training who understood that certain aspects of air combat remained constant despite technological advancement. As the formation continued climbing toward increasingly dangerous airspace, Valkyrie found herself facing a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could follow orders and maintain formation, while watching a fellow aviator potentially face destruction alone. Or she could trust her instincts and attempt to provide assistance to someone who was clearly asking for help using methods that transcended political boundaries and military hierarchies. The decision crystallized with the absolute clarity that accompanied moments of genuine moral consequence. Without requesting permission or announcing her intentions, Valkyrie eased her F-22 out of formation and began a gentle turn that would bring her alongside the damaged aircraft. The maneuver was executed with the smooth precision that came from years of formation flying, but she knew that every other pilot in the formation would recognize it as a direct violation of flight leader instructions. Her career was now secondary to her obligation to a fellow aviator who was clearly in distress and asking for assistance. Blade's voice exploded through her headset with the fury of someone whose authority had been directly challenged in front of subordinates. Valkyrie, return to formation immediately. You are in direct violation of orders, and I will have you grounded for the remainder of your career. The threat was real and immediate, but Valkyrie found that 23 years of exemplary service had given her the confidence to trust her judgment when it conflicted with orders that seemed tactically inappropriate. As her F-22 drew alongside the damaged aircraft, details became visible that had been impossible to discern from a distance. The pilot's helmet carried patches and markings that were definitely American in origin, and the flight suit bore the subdued insignia of someone who had earned the right to fly the most sophisticated aircraft in the American inventory. More significantly, the canopy damage revealed a face that was unmistakably female, highlighting the gender dynamics that had shaped Valkyrie's own career in military aviation. Recognition dawned with the force of emotional revelation. The pilot was not an enemy aviator or a confused civilian who had wandered into restricted airspace. She was a fellow female military pilot who had somehow survived circumstances that should have been fatal, and was now making a desperate attempt to return to friendly territory using an aircraft that was barely capable of controlled flight. The courage required for such an undertaking was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Valkyrie keyed her radio for a transmission on a frequency that had not been monitored by military authorities for nearly 20 years. "Sparrow, this is Valkyrie on guard. If you can hear this transmission, waggle your wings twice and I will provide assistance." The call sign was one that appeared in classified records of pilots who had been declared missing in action during deep reconnaissance missions. But intelligence sources suggested that some of those aviators might have survived in circumstances that remained highly classified. The response was immediate and unmistakable. The damaged aircraft waggled its wings twice, paused, then repeated the signal. Someone was acknowledging not just the transmission but the specific call sign, confirming both identity and the desperate nature of their current situation. Sparrow was alive, flying a crippled fighter toward what might be her last chance for freedom, and asking for assistance from someone who understood the deeper meaning of military service that transcended standard operational procedures. The realization transformed everything about the intercept mission. This was not about enforcing airspace restrictions or investigating unknown aircraft. This was about recovering a fellow American pilot who had been presumed dead for years, but had somehow survived in circumstances that could only be imagined. The damaged F-16 represented not just mechanical ingenuity, but human resilience that embodied the best traditions of military aviation. Valkyrie made a decision that would either save a life or end her career. She was going to escort Sparrow to friendly territory regardless of orders from flight leadership or potential consequences from military authorities. Sometimes service to country meant making decisions that transcended immediate tactical considerations, and this was one of those moments when personal integrity mattered more than career advancement or peer approval. She keyed her microphone for a transmission that would commit her to a course of action from which there would be no retreat. "Sparrow, Valkyrie, I am going to provide escort and navigation assistance to friendly territory. Follow my lead and maintain current heading until I signal otherwise. Help is on the way." The words carried the weight of a promise that she intended to keep regardless of personal cost. The response came not through radio, but through the damaged aircraft's navigation strobes, which shifted from the standard SOS pattern to a sequence of flashes that spelled out "Thank you" in Morse code. Someone was expressing gratitude using a method that connected current events to the earliest traditions of air-to-air communication, acknowledging not just tactical assistance, but recognition of shared values that defined military aviation across generations. Behind them, the remaining 3 F-22s had adjusted formation to follow at a distance, their pilots undoubtedly confused by the rapid evolution of what had begun as a routine intercept mission. Blade's voice crackled through the radio with barely controlled fury, demanding explanations and threatening consequences, but Valkyrie found that she could ignore the threats with surprising ease. Some situations required individual judgment that superseded command authority, and this was clearly one of those circumstances. As the two aircraft flew toward friendly territory, Valkyrie found herself studying the damaged F-16 with growing respect for the pilot who had kept it airborne under impossible conditions. The battle damage was extensive and clearly recent, suggesting that Sparrow had fought her way out of hostile territory using a combination of tactical skill and mechanical ingenuity that represented military aviation at its finest. Whatever her story, it was clearly one that deserved to be told rather than ending in a remote crash site where the truth would remain forever buried. The flight toward safety continued in companionable silence, broken only by occasional navigation updates and fuel status reports. Two female pilots were sharing a moment that transcended words, united by experiences that could only be understood by someone who had faced similar challenges in a profession dominated by men and shaped by traditions that often struggled to accommodate changing demographics. The sky around them stretched endlessly, indifferent to human concerns, but serving as the canvas upon which their professional lives had been painted. As they approached friendly airspace, Valkyrie realized that the day's events would be remembered as a defining moment in her military career. She had chosen to trust her instincts over direct orders, potentially saving a life while risking everything she had worked to achieve during more than 2 decades of dedicated service. The decision felt absolutely correct despite its probable consequences, confirming that some aspects of military service were more important than career advancement or peer approval. The damaged F-16 beside her continued its steady flight toward safety, navigation strobes still flashing their coded messages to anyone who understood the deeper traditions of military aviation. Sparrow was going home after years of presumed death, carried by courage and determination that exemplified the best qualities of American military personnel. Her survival was a testament to training, dedication, and the kind of resilience that could not be taught in any classroom or flight simulator. The radio crackled with transmissions from air traffic control as they entered friendly airspace, but Valkyrie found that the official communications seemed less important than the silent understanding between two pilots who had shared a moment that would define the rest of their careers. Some experiences transcended standard operational procedures and touched the essence of what it meant to serve in the military profession of arms. As they began their descent toward the recovery airfield, the damaged aircraft's engines began showing signs of impending failure, confirming that Sparrow's timing had been absolutely perfect. A few more minutes in the air and mechanical failure would have ended her story in hostile territory, transforming a rescue mission into a recovery operation. The margins of survival in military aviation were often measured in seconds and miles, and today those margins had been just sufficient to allow a happy ending to what could have been a tragedy. Ground control vectored them toward the emergency runway where crash and rescue equipment stood ready to assist, with what was clearly going to be a challenging landing. The F-16's hydraulic systems were failing, making normal flight controls increasingly unresponsive. But Sparrow continued to fly with the smooth precision that marked someone who understood her aircraft's limitations and knew how to extract maximum performance from damaged systems. The landing was a masterpiece of pilot skill overcoming mechanical failure. Despite severely compromised flight controls, Sparrow managed to touch down on the center line of the runway and bring her damaged fighter to a controlled stop just short of the crash barrier. Emergency crews surrounded the aircraft immediately, but it was clear that the pilot had successfully completed one of the most challenging flights in recent military aviation history. As Valkyrie taxied her F-22 toward the parking area, she could see ground personnel helping Sparrow climb down from the cockpit of her damaged aircraft. Even from a distance, it was obvious that the pilot was physically and emotionally exhausted from an ordeal that could only be imagined by someone who had never faced similar circumstances. But she was alive, she was home, and she had a story that would become part of military aviation legend. The debriefing that followed would be complex and probably career-ending for Valkyrie, but she found that the prospect of disciplinary action seemed less important than the knowledge that she had helped save a life and recover a fellow aviator who represented the best traditions of military service. Some decisions were made not because they were tactically sound or career-enhancing, but because they were morally correct and consistent with the deepest values of the profession of arms. Later that evening, as she sat in the squadron ready room writing her after-action report, Valkyrie reflected on the day's events and their probable consequences. Her decision to break formation and assist Sparrow would certainly result in disciplinary action and possibly end her military career, but she felt no regret about choices that had been guided by instinct and experience rather than standard operating procedures. The story of Sparrow's survival would eventually emerge through classified debriefings and intelligence reports, but the public would never know the full details of how an American pilot had survived years behind enemy lines and finally made her way home using courage, determination, and an obsolete fighter aircraft held together by mechanical ingenuity and sheer force of will. Such stories were the foundation upon which military aviation was built, representing individual heroism that transcended political boundaries and tactical considerations. Outside the ready room windows, the evening sky stretched toward infinity, painted in colors that reminded Valkyrie of every sunset she had witnessed from the cockpit of high-performance aircraft during more than 2 decades of military service. The sky had been her office, her sanctuary, and her greatest source of professional satisfaction, and she knew that regardless of what disciplinary action might result from the day's events, she would always have the memories of moments when human courage and mechanical precision had combined to achieve what seemed impossible. The investigation that followed would reveal that Sparrow had indeed been shot down during a classified reconnaissance mission nearly 5 years earlier, but had managed to evade capture and eventually acquire the damaged F-16 from sources that remained classified at the highest levels of government. Her escape and eventual return to friendly territory represented one of the most remarkable survival stories in recent military history, a testament to training, determination, and the kind of resourcefulness that could not be taught in any formal curriculum. For Valkyrie, the knowledge that she had played a small role in that homecoming was worth whatever consequences might follow from her decision to trust instinct over orders. Military service was ultimately about people rather than policies, and sometimes the most important decisions were made by individual judgment rather than institutional procedures. The traditions of military aviation were built upon such moments, when individual pilots had chosen to do what was right rather than what was officially sanctioned. The court-martial that many expected never materialized, largely because senior commanders recognized that Valkyrie's actions had achieved results that vindicated her tactical judgment, even if they violated standard procedures. Instead, she received a formal reprimand that would limit her promotion opportunities, but allow her to continue flying and serving in the profession she loved. The compromise satisfied military discipline, while acknowledging that exceptional circumstances sometimes required exceptional responses. Sparrow's recovery became a classified case study in survival and evasion that would be studied by future generations of military personnel, but the details of her ordeal remained known only to those with appropriate security clearances. She returned to active duty after extensive medical and psychological evaluation, eventually becoming an instructor pilot responsible for training others in the skills that had enabled her own survival. Her experience became part of the institutional knowledge that kept military aviation connected to its finest traditions. Years later, as Valkyrie approached retirement after a career that spanned nearly 3 decades of military service, she would often think about that morning when two damaged aircraft had found each other in hostile airspace and shared a moment that transcended words. The memory would remind her that military service was ultimately about human connections forged in circumstances that revealed the deepest truths about courage, sacrifice, and the bonds that united those who chose to serve their country in the profession of arms. The final chapter of both women's military careers would be defined by that shared experience, a reminder that sometimes the most important moments in military service occurred not in formal ceremonies or official recognition, but in brief encounters between individuals who understood that duty extended beyond regulations and encompassed obligations to fellow human beings who wore the same uniform and shared the same commitment to service before self. On clear mornings when the sky stretched endlessly toward distant horizons, Valkyrie would remember the sight of a damaged F-16 climbing desperately toward freedom, its navigation strobe spelling out messages in a language older than digital warfare. She would remember the moment when military protocol yielded to human compassion, when years of training crystallized into a single decision that defined the essence of what it meant to serve others who shared the same sky and the same commitment to something larger than themselves. The investigation into Sparrow's disappearance and miraculous return revealed details that remained classified for years afterward. She had been shot down during a deep reconnaissance mission over territory that officially did not exist on any military maps. Her F-16 had been struck by surface-to-air missiles while photographing installations that intelligence agencies suspected were being used for weapons development by hostile forces seeking to destabilize regional security arrangements. The ejection had occurred at low altitude over mountainous terrain that provided concealment but little hope for rescue by conventional means. Standard survival protocols assumed that downed pilots in such areas would be captured within 72 hours or succumb to exposure and injuries that medical training could delay but not prevent indefinitely. Sparrow's survival for nearly 5 years represented achievements in evasion and adaptation that exceeded the parameters of any military training program. During her years behind enemy lines, she had lived with sympathetic civilians who risked their own lives to shelter an American pilot whose presence could have brought devastating retaliation from occupation forces. The relationships she formed transcended political boundaries and military loyalties, becoming bonds of shared humanity that reminded her why military service ultimately existed to protect people rather than advance abstract strategic objectives. The damaged F-16 that carried her to freedom had been abandoned at a forward airbase that was evacuated during a tactical withdrawal. Sparrow had spent months learning to maintain and modify the aircraft using spare parts salvaged from other damaged planes and improvised repairs that would have impressed the most experienced maintenance technicians. Her engineering solutions represented the kind of innovation that emerged from desperation tempered by professional competence. The flight that brought her back to friendly territory had been planned for months, timed to coincide with weather patterns and intelligence assessments that suggested optimal chances for avoiding interception by hostile forces. Every aspect of the escape had been calculated to maximize survival probability, from fuel consumption rates to communication protocols that could identify her to friendly forces without revealing classified information to potential enemies monitoring radio frequencies. Valkyrie's decision to break formation and provide assistance had been the final variable in an equation that could have ended in tragedy without intervention from someone who understood the deeper traditions of military aviation. The recognition of Morse code transmissions had required not just technical knowledge, but intuitive understanding of how desperate pilots might attempt communication when standard methods were unavailable or compromised by equipment damage. The court of inquiry that reviewed the incident focused primarily on whether Valkyrie's actions had been justified by circumstances or represented dangerous precedent that could undermine military discipline in future operations. Testimony from senior pilots emphasized that air combat required split-second decisions based on incomplete information, and that rigid adherence to procedures could sometimes prevent optimal outcomes in rapidly evolving tactical situations. The final report concluded that Valkyrie's actions had been consistent with the highest traditions of military aviation, which recognized obligations to fellow aviators that transcended immediate tactical considerations. While her violation of direct orders warranted formal discipline, the successful recovery of a missing pilot justified tactical flexibility that demonstrated sound judgment under pressure. The compromise satisfied institutional requirements while acknowledging exceptional circumstances. Sparrow's debriefings provided intelligence information that proved invaluable for understanding enemy capabilities and intentions in the region where she had been shot down. Her observations of military installations, troop movements, and local political dynamics filled intelligence gaps that had existed since her disappearance. The information she provided helped prevent conflicts that could have cost hundreds of additional lives, making her survival strategically significant beyond its human dimensions. The psychological evaluation that followed her return revealed resilience factors that became part of military research into how individuals respond to extreme stress over extended periods. Her ability to maintain hope and continue planning for eventual escape demonstrated mental toughness that could be studied but not easily replicated in training environments. Her experience became a case study in human adaptation that informed survival training for future generations of military personnel. Both women eventually retired from active duty, with honors that reflected careers defined by service above self and dedication to principles that elevated military aviation above mere technical proficiency. Their shared experience became part of squadron lore, passed down through informal conversations between experienced pilots and newcomers who needed to understand that flying military aircraft was about more than managing advanced technology or following procedural checklists. The friendship that developed between Valkyrie and Sparrow transcended their initial encounter in hostile airspace, becoming a bond that lasted throughout their remaining years of military service and into retirement. They understood each other with the wordless communication that existed between people who had shared experiences that could not be fully explained to those who had not faced similar circumstances. Their conversations contained silences that spoke volumes about courage, sacrifice, and the price of serving in professions that demanded everything. Annual reunions of their squadron included ceremonial flights that honored pilots who had made the ultimate sacrifice in service to their country, but also celebrated moments when courage and competence had prevented tragedy and brought people home safely. The formation flights served as reminders that military aviation was built upon individual decisions made by people who understood that their choices could mean the difference between life and death for fellow human beings who shared the same sky. The legacy of their encounter extended beyond personal relationships to influence training programs that emphasized tactical flexibility and situational awareness over rigid adherence to predetermined procedures. Flight instructors used their story to illustrate principles that could not be taught through classroom lectures or flight simulator exercises. Lessons that emerged only from real-world experiences where theoretical knowledge intersected with human judgment under extreme pressure. Young pilots entering military aviation learned about the importance of trusting instincts developed through experience and training, while understanding that such trust carried enormous responsibility for consequences that could affect not just individual careers, but the lives of people who depended upon military professionals to make correct decisions when circumstances provided no time for extended deliberation or consultation with higher authorities. The aircraft that had carried Sparrow to freedom was eventually restored and placed in a museum dedicated to military aviation history, where it served as a tangible reminder that the most sophisticated technology was only as effective as the human beings who operated it. Visitors could see the battle damage and improvised repairs that had kept the aircraft airborne during its final mission, but the full story of courage and determination remained accessible only to those who understood the deeper traditions of military service. Maintenance crews who worked on modern aircraft were shown photographs of Sparrow's improvisations, demonstrating how professional competence and resourcefulness could overcome seemingly impossible technical challenges. The repairs she had performed using salvaged parts and improvised tools represented problem-solving skills that could not be taught through formal training programs, but emerged from the intersection of technical knowledge and desperate determination to survive and return home. The Morse code signals that had enabled Sparrow's identification became part of communications training that emphasized backup methods for situations where modern technology might be compromised by equipment failure or enemy action. Students learned that military communication had evolved through decades of technological advancement, but fundamental principles of conveying information remained constant regardless of the sophistication of available equipment. Intelligence analysts studied Sparrow's escape route and timing to understand how individual initiative could achieve results that exceeded the capabilities of formal rescue operations. Her success demonstrated that military personnel with appropriate training and sufficient determination could survive and operate in hostile environments for extended periods, providing valuable information about enemy capabilities while maintaining hope for eventual return to friendly forces. The strategic implications of her survival extended beyond intelligence gathering to demonstrate American commitment to recovering personnel who were missing in action. The knowledge that military forces would continue searching for missing personnel and would recognize and assist them regardless of how much time had passed since their disappearance served as both morale factor for current military personnel and deterrent to enemies who might hope that captured Americans would be forgotten over time. Diplomatic channels were used to express gratitude to the civilian populations who had risked their lives to shelter Sparrow during her years behind enemy lines, though such recognition had to be carefully managed to avoid compromising people who continued living under occupation. The relationships she had formed demonstrated that military service ultimately existed to protect human dignity and freedom, rather than advance narrow national interests that ignored the welfare of innocent people caught in conflicts, not of their choosing. The medical care she received after her return included treatment for injuries and malnutrition that had accumulated during years of surviving in conditions that challenged basic human endurance. Her recovery served as testimony to both the physical resilience of military personnel and the importance of maintaining hope under circumstances that might have justified despair. Her experience became part of medical research into long-term survival and recovery from extended periods of extreme stress. The public never learned the full details of Sparrow's ordeal or her dramatic return to friendly territory, but military personnel understood that her story represented the kind of courage and determination that defined their profession at its finest. The classified nature of her experience paradoxically enhanced its significance within military culture, where the most important stories were often those that could not be shared with people who had not earned the right to know them through their own service and sacrifice. Veterans organizations eventually recognized both women for contributions to military aviation that extended beyond their individual achievements to influence training, doctrine, and understanding of what military service demanded from those who chose to dedicate their lives to protecting others. Their recognition came not through public ceremonies or media coverage, but through the quiet acknowledgement of peers who understood the significance of what they had accomplished and the price they had paid for their service. The influence of their story continued long after both women had transitioned to civilian life, becoming part of the informal curriculum that shaped how military aviators understood their obligations to each other and to the traditions that connected current service members to previous generations who had faced similar challenges under different circumstances. The lessons they embodied could not be captured in regulations or training manuals, but were transmitted through personal relationships and shared experiences that defined military culture. Flight instructors continued to use their example when teaching young pilots about decision-making under pressure, emphasizing that the most important choices often involved human factors that transcended technical considerations or procedural requirements. The ability to recognize when circumstances demanded individual judgment, rather than institutional compliance, was identified as a critical skill that distinguished competent pilots from exceptional ones who could adapt to unexpected situations. The friendship between Valkyrie and Sparrow became a model for relationships within military aviation that demonstrated how shared experiences could create bonds stronger than those based on rank, gender, or other demographic factors. Their mutual respect was founded upon recognition of professional competence and personal courage that had been tested under circumstances where such qualities could mean the difference between life and death. Retirement ceremonies for both women included tributes from colleagues who understood that their careers had been defined by service that exceeded normal expectations and had influenced the profession in ways that would continue benefiting future generations. The honors they received were meaningful precisely because they came from people who were qualified to assess the significance of their contributions to military aviation and the broader defense of democratic values. The aircraft they had flown during their careers were eventually replaced by more advanced technology, but the principles they had demonstrated remained constant across technological generations. The importance of human judgment, tactical flexibility, and commitment to fellow service members transcended specific aircraft types or weapon systems, representing enduring truths about military service that could not be automated or programmed into artificial intelligence systems. Their story became part of the larger narrative of military aviation that connected the earliest pioneers, who had risked their lives to develop flight capabilities, with contemporary pilots, who operated the most sophisticated aircraft ever conceived. The common thread that united all generations of military aviators was the willingness to risk personal safety in service of objectives that were larger than individual concerns or career advancement. Museums dedicated to military aviation eventually included exhibits that honored not just technological advancement, but the human stories that gave meaning to mechanical innovation. Visitors could learn about aircraft specifications and performance capabilities, but the most important lessons concerned the people who had operated such equipment under conditions that revealed the deepest truths about courage, sacrifice, and dedication to principles that justify the risks inherent in military service. The educational programs associated with such exhibits emphasize that military technology, was ultimately about protecting human dignity and democratic values, rather than achieving abstract strategic objectives that ignored the welfare of people whose freedom depended upon the willingness of others to serve in dangerous professions. The aircraft on display were tangible reminders of choices made by individuals who had understood that their service could make a difference in the lives of people they would never meet, but whose freedom they were sworn to protect. Aviation museums became gathering places for veterans who wanted to share stories and memories with people who could understand the significance of experiences that could not be fully explained to those who had not served in similar capacities. The informal conversations that occurred in such settings were often more educational than formal exhibits, providing insights into military service that could only be conveyed through personal relationships between people who had faced comparable challenges. The legacy of Valkyrie and Sparrow's encounter continued to influence military aviation long after both women had passed away, their story becoming part of the institutional memory that shaped how future generations understood their obligations to each other, and to the traditions that defined military service at its finest. Their example demonstrated that the most important aspects of military professionalism could not be taught through formal instruction, but were learned through experience and transmitted through relationships between people who shared common values and commitment to service above self.